Hello, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another book series talk for the Center of Islam in the Contemporary World at Shanghai University. I'm your host, Emin Sinanovic. I'm Executive Director of the CICW. And at the CICW, we consider issues related to cultural and theological and other challenges facing Muslims in the contemporary world and how Muslims answer these challenges. We discuss latest works related to these issues and topics. And we also provide research grants and do all other different research activities. So the best way to find out about the center is to check our website at contemporaryislam.org. That is contemporaryislam.org. I apologize for a few minute late start. We just had a little bit of a technical issue, but I guess that happens from time to time in spite of our best effort. So we are very honored to have with us today Dr. SherAli Tareen from Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. Welcome, SherAli. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much, Erwin, for having me on your podcast, on your show.
Absolutely, absolutely. SherAli is an old friend. That's a kind of disclosure. He is also a wonderful scholar on South Asia, contemporary issues of revival and reform in Islam. And today we are discussing his book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, which just won, just a few days ago, I believe, the American Institute of Pakistan Studies 2020 Book Prize. So congratulations, SherAli.
Thank you very much.
All right. So as I usually begin these discussions, I want to ask you the same question I ask of every author. Why did you write this book? What were you trying to achieve with it? And how does it relate to your broader intellectual works and publications?
Well, thank you so much, Edmund. First of all, thank you so much for your time and for inviting me on this show. It really is an honor and pleasure. And congratulations on this new center and all the great work that you're doing. And thank you very much for the time of all those tuning in or those who are later watching this this video. Well, let me take a couple minutes each, 2 minutes to just describe what the book is about and its sort of broad architecture. And then I'll take a couple of minutes just telling you what it argues and why it might be significant. So primarily, this is a book on Muslim intellectual discourses and debates in late 18th and 19th century South Asia, primarily North India. And it primarily looks at arguably the most authoritative, influential, and prolific Sunni Muslim scholars in South Asia from the late 18th to the 19th, beginning of the 19th and the late 19th centuries, and really looks at the question of, in this transition into British colonialism and then the consolidation of British colonial power, what were some of the major discourses and debates that we see among the Muslim traditionalist scholars or the ulama? So very briefly, the book is divided into 3 parts. It has 12 chapters. The first part looks at the context of the late 18th and the early 19th century by looking at scholars such as the preeminent 18th century scholar Shah Waliullah, died 1762. And then it looks at a very fierce polemic between 2 early 19th century scholars, Shah Waliullah's grandson, Shah Muhammad Ismail, died 1831, and then another major scholar called Fazl Haq Khairabadi. So this early 19th century context in which there were 2 major streams of scholarship, these 2 major scholarly families, the Waliullah family and the Khairabadi family, and their intellectual debates and polemics. Then in the second part, it moves to these 2 major reform movements that emerge in South Asia, called the Barelvīs and the Deobandīs, and it looks at the debates of their pioneers over major questions of law, theology, and ritual practice. And then finally, the last part of the book looks at intra-Deobandī tensions and intra-Deobandī sort of debates by looking at a very interesting figure called Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, who died 1899, who was the Sufi master of the Deoband pioneers. And it looks at how he tried to bring together these competing groups of scholars and what kinds of tensions and interesting debates that generated. So that is in some measure the broad book that broadly what the book is about. And primarily, I know we'll go into the details in a moment, but primarily it's a book about Muslim scholarly debates about how one should remember the Prophet in conditions of modernity. And the whole theme is that as Muslims in South Asia lose their political sovereignty with the fall of the Mughal Empire, how does that shift the focus of the community on the question of divine sovereignty and its relationship to prophetic authority and the practice of everyday life? So what we might call the relationship between God, the Prophet, and the community. And that's what I call a certain kind of a political theology and competing political theologies that emerge in South Asia. Now, the significance of the book, or why I wrote it. So primarily, Ermin, the aspiration of this book is to contribute simultaneously to three different fields: Islamic studies, South Asian studies, and what one might call critical secularism studies. So in Islamic studies, what I was interested in was these long-running questions and debates on matters to do with law, theology, things like heretical innovation, bid'ah, and so on, that have a much longer history. How do they play out in the context of South Asia, in the writings of these ulama who wrote interchangeably in Urdu, Arabic, and Persian? So I wanted to look at that context in South Asia. In South Asian studies, we have many great studies that look at the institutional and political or social histories of these movements, but there wasn't much emphasis on the religious thought, the normative sort of content of these debates and polemics. So I really wanted to bring the focus onto that. We knew that there was one group of scholars that opposes the Mawlid, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, another group that supports it. But what were their arguments? What was at stake for them spiritually and politically in terms of these arguments? And then finally, in terms of critical secularism studies, as you know, Ermin, in the field of anthropology, etc., there has been a push in the last couple of decades following the work of scholars like Talal Asad, Abba Mahmoud, and so on, who've tried to critique the religion-secular binary and have tried to show that rather than look at these two categories as oppositional binaries, one ought to look at secularism as a form of power that constantly regulates the boundaries of what does count and does not count as religion. So in some ways, it has tried to disrupt the secular promise of canonizing religion into disciplinary binaries. And I've tried to contribute to this field, Ermin, by trying to disrupt binaries which are very prominent and dominant when it comes to the study of Muslim reformist thought. Binaries like Sufi legal, which is the most common binary through which the Deobandī-Barelvī debate that I focus on in this book is often looked at. Binaries like conservative, liberal, or extremist, modernist, reformist, non-reformist. And what I've really tried to show here, to close off this question, is I've tried to, again, disrupt the secular promise or the secular fantasy of canonizing religious life, of canonizing disciplined life into these binaries, into these easily digestible but ultimately distorted binaries, not by doing a genealogy of secular power, but by closely navigating and doing a close reading of the logics of the tradition itself. So in some ways, the politics of this project are very much aligned with critical secularism studies, but I try to conduct that project through a close reading of the internal logics of the tradition. So the reason why this is, I would say, a significant project is that it talks about an intra-Muslim debate and polemic, which has had massive consequences for how South Asian Muslim identity is imagined, not only in South Asia, but in diaspora communities around the world today. And these questions to this day lead to heated polemics and debates in contemporary Pakistan, India, in online polemical chat rooms and so on. So it looks at the beginnings, the historical beginnings and the complexities of this debate by closely attending to its internal logics.
Thank you so much. In a way, I think you've anticipated the next question I have for you, and you have half answered it. So maybe just rather briefly, if you could talk about this issue. We find often especially in Western academia, in popular discourse, there is this Sufism law dichotomy that people talk about. And so Sufism is presented as a spiritual mystic version of Islam that's somehow devoid of law. And there were even writings on how Rumi had been decontextualized or de-Islamized, if you will, taken out of its Islamic context and just focused on this like love poetry as if he was writing to his lover when he was, but his lover wasn't a human being necessarily for the most part. And so that kind of dichotomy is prevalent in the academia and popular discourse, especially in the West. How do you discuss this dichotomy that you already indicated between conservative and progressive or liberal, between Sufism and law, dichotomies that are so deeply embedded in popular understanding, but also in the way how much of the academia had approached Islam for the past decades, if not centuries.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Herman. So yes, in some ways, this is a great case study for precisely trying to disrupt these kinds of binaries and dichotomies. So oftentimes the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic, not only in terms of the popular and the common stereotype around it, but even in some very serious academic scholarship, is looked at through the prism of what I call the law Sufism binary, that there was a group of scholars who were protagonists of a rigid kind of a legalism and were the banner bearers of the Sharia. And then on the other hand, if there were some scholars who might have had a more permissible attitude towards certain ritual practices, like celebration of the Prophet's birthday, they were the banner bearers of Sufism and so on. And this kind of a narrative especially took on a special importance and in fact was supported quite rigorously in the post 9/11 context, where there were many Washington, D.C. think tanks, Heritage Foundation, etc., who published papers in trying to, again, present this kind of a good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative, whereby the definition of what counts as goodness often aligned more with US imperial political interests in places like South Asia than the internal logics of these debates. The reason why this is a very problematic binary, in this case especially, in many other cases also, is that empirically does not hold, first of all. Both of these groups of scholars, as we will discuss further in due time, were major scholars of law, of Hanafi law, and they were major Sufi masters. So just empirically, this does not work. But the reason why I think this has persisted, and I'm not, of course, the first one who's tried to critique this binary, but the reason why it has persisted in the study of modern South Asian Islam is precisely because we did not have much of, by way of a close reading of the internal logics of their debates and discourses. Mm-hmm. And what I try to do in trying to overcome this binary is present a theoretical key or a category that I introduce here, the category of what I call political theology. Now, political theology has been a category which has become quite important in Western academia, especially in religious studies and other humanistic sort of disciplines, whereby the main argument of this field of political theology has been that it has tried to look at the theological foundations of modern liberal politics, especially the modern state, following the work of the theorist Carl Schmitt and his famous text Political Theology, which really showed that all modern day political concepts are secularized theological concepts, especially the modern state, which is primarily a secularized version of the divine sovereign, though it operates according to a different logic. So what I've tried to do in this book, Ermin, is try to invert the logic of this field of political theology by asking not so much the theological underpinnings of the modern liberal state, but rather asking the question of how shifting political conditions inform theological debates and discourses. Mm-hmm. So in this transition of South Asia from the Mughal Empire to British colonialism, and this hinge moment in this transition, how does the crisis of sovereignty, how does the crisis of political sovereignty inform debates on the nature of divine sovereignty and its relationship to prophetic authority and the practice of everyday ritual life? And what I try to show is that these two groups of scholars, or these two streams of scholars in South Asian Islam, really were reflective of two competing political theologies, that might be a much more theoretically adept way of capturing this debate and its aspirations, rather than these kinds of binaries like the law Sufism binary. So that's what I try to argue, and that's how I try to overcome this law Sufism binary.
Okay, thank you very much. So let us now go into the book, so to say. Let us delve into the book. So I think a good way to introduce that is, for those of us who are not that very familiar with this, can you briefly explain to us the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic? What is it about? We kept hearing about the Barelvīs-Deobandīs, and for those of us who are not specialists in that field or in that about that part of the world, we know some basics. But if you could kind of explain to us in a few minutes, why is this important? What is the content of that debate? And how is that debate relevant for the rest of the world and the rest of the Muslim world, for instance?
Absolutely. So in some ways, the context of this debate is really the conditions of British colonialism in South Asia, and this transition of South Asia from the Mughal Empire to the British Empire, and this the as I'm saying, this loss of Muslim political sovereignty that generates these debates on the nature of divine sovereignty and the status of the Prophet in modernity. That's why this book is called Defending Muhammad in Modernity. So in essentially, to go very slowly, these two words of Muslim reform movements, Barelvīs and Deobandīs. We get these two words from the names of small towns in North India called Deoband and Barelvī, where the major pioneers of these movements were from. This emerges in the late 19th century in the aftermath of the War of 1857, in which Indian Muslims are brutally defeated by the British. And there is this realization that Muslims have lost their political sovereignty. And with this realization, the emphasis shifts on the question of how do we preserve an Indian Muslim identity and the purity of this identity from the threat of internal and external others. So that is in some ways the context of this debate. Both of these scholars, as I said, are major scholars of Hanafi law and are major Sufi masters. The Deoband school from a lineage of Chishti Sabiri Sufis, and the Barelvī school and their pioneer, Ahmad Raza Khan from the Qadri Sufi order. Very briefly, what this polemic was about. So in some ways, what I try to show, Armin, is that what we see in this polemic are two competing imaginaries of Prophet Muhammad and the relationship of those imaginaries to what an Indian Muslim identity and an ideal normative public sphere must look like. So in the Deobandi imaginary, the most important aspect of the Prophet's persona is his humanity. The Prophet's perfection is established through the perfection of his humanity. And the job, the responsibility of the masses then is to cultivate a public sphere that affirms that humanity and that does not confuse prophetic authority with divine sovereignty. So their major concern was that there are these ritual practices operating in the public sphere that are undermining the sovereignty, the absolute sovereignty of the divine. And so that was their political theology in trying to propose the humanity of the Prophet as being the most important part of his persona. They wanted to cultivate a public order, a public sphere that also was committed to that model of the relationship between God, the Prophet, and the community. On the other hand, for the Barelvī school and for its its founder, Ahmad Raza Khan, Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, for him, the divine sovereignty and the absoluteness of divine sovereignty was not in opposition with prophetic authority. The absoluteness of divine sovereignty was established precisely by affirming the exceptionality of the Prophet as the most beloved of God's beings. And the job of the community then was to cultivate a public sphere that affirms the exceptionality of the Prophet through participating in rituals like the celebration of the Prophet's birthday and so on. So these are the two competing political theologies that I call that underlie this underlying debate and polemic, the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic.
Right. So what intervention does your book make in helping us understand this polemic? What are some of your major interventions and what are some of your major contributions?
Right. So in some ways, one thing that I realized as I was writing this book is that many of the issues that they debated in some way or the other had to do with the status of the Prophet in modernity. So for example, there are issues such as the celebration of the Prophet's birthday or the Mawlid, or the question of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown and its nature and its scope, or ilmul ghaib, or questions of prophetic intercession or shafa'ah. And these two very interesting questions that emerge in the context of South Asia, which is one of them called Imkan-e-Nazir, the possibility of a second Muhammad being produced, and Imkan-e-Kizb, or the possibility of God contravening on his own promise. So all of these issues in some ways center on the question of how one should imagine the Prophet in modernity. So what we see here is that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, the focus shifts on the question of how one should imagine and remember the Prophet, and how does that imagination and that remembrance then correspond to what an ideal Indian Muslim public should look like in conditions of colonial modernity. So in some ways, the central sort of intervention is to think about this relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life as the conceptual key through which these kinds of intra-Muslim debates can be examined and navigated, rather than to reduce them to these predictable but problematic binaries like legal, Sufi, moderate, extremist, reformist, non-reformist, and so on.
Okay, thank you. So now it emerges why I think you chose the title Defending Muhammad in Modernity, because just by reading the title of the book, it's not actually easy to understand what the book is about. It doesn't say that it's about South Asia or the Indian subcontinent or the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic. So in some ways, you would say then that both of these sides, even though they approach these issues quite differently, were in fact defending the Prophet and defending his integrity and his place, not only in Muslim theology, but in wider cosmological almost scheme of things.
Absolutely. And, a great way for me to further elaborate on this point is by talking about their debate, for example, on one issue. I'll just use one issue to illustrate this point, which is their whole debate on the question of heretical innovation or bid'ah. Of course, as you know, Armin, that this idea of innovation is obviously does not mean that all innovations are problematic, but these are innovations which oppose the normative model of the Prophet or the Sunnah. And the reason why I translated this word as heretical innovation is because underlying the main sort of conceptual architecture of this concept, even in the non-South Asian context, for example, if we see a text like the 14th century Andalusian Maliki jurist Ibrahim al-Shatibi, his famous text Al-I'tisam, in that also, of course, he comes up with this very interesting definition of bid'ah as an innovated practice in religion, which simulates the Sharia, so this idea of simulation, or this idea of when human beings cultivate a parallel order of normativity, which is seemingly pious, which is seemingly salutary, but in fact simulates the obligations of the Sharia, like praying, fasting, pilgrimage, and so on. So this quality of hairesis, or what one might call choosing on the part of the human subject, a parallel order of normativity. So for the Deobandī school and its pioneers, like this famous scholar SherAli Tareen, died 1943. For him, that is precisely what was wrong in the conduct of the masses in 19th century India. That in their view, these practices in and of themselves were excellent practices, like celebration of the Prophet's birthday, or this famous practice in South Asia of distributing food on the third day of someone's death, with the logic being that the blessings you receive from this act of charity will then be transmitted to the soul of the deceased. These were great rituals in and of themselves. But the masses were engaging in these rituals with such regularity, with such passion, with such zeal, that they began to simulate the obligatory acts of religion. And that was in some ways the sin of hairesis, and that what made these heretical innovations. And they were also argued that many corruptions have entered into these rituals, like ostentatiousness or affectation, the expenditure of too much wealth, and so on. And the intentionality of the actors is not one of engaging in pious practices, but showing off wealth and so on. So their whole argument was that, these practices at one point had been very pious, but over time, the masses have lost the purpose of these rituals, the original purpose of these rituals. And they saw their own role as these great awakeners and reformers who were intervening in the disciplined life of the community and reminding them of the normative values of these practices according to the Sharia, that these were actually only permissible practices, these were not obligatory, and to remind them of the original purpose of these rituals. Now, for Ahmad Raza Khan and the Barelvī school, they also really were critical of the masses and their conduct. So this is a very important point that I make throughout the book. This is not a debate between reformers and non-reformers. He also had a conception of reform. But according to him, his main point was that those rituals which God had designated as permissible, as mubah, you cannot outlaw them unless there was some really emergency reason to do so. And his whole argument was that rather than banning these practices, like celebrating the Prophet's birthday, especially those practices which were a means to exalt the Prophet, you correct the conduct of the masses, and you try to excise the corruptions which have been attached to it. And his whole argument was that there is more of a compatibility between the everyday life of the masses and the social conditions that exist in South Asia at that time. So the scholars don't need to intervene and disrupt these practices, but rather ensure the continuity of these practices and just remove the corruptions which have entered into it. So here we see two very competing conceptions of time, history, and normative practice, and two very competing notions of the relationship between divine sovereignty, the values of the Sharia, prophetic authority, and then the everyday conduct of the masses, what I call competing political theologies.
I see. So that's a very useful way of looking at it. So in many ways, actually, it emerges that both of these movements are reformist in a way, except that the scope of their reform is quite different. One is perhaps smaller than the other, but they are both, in a way, reformist movements. Would you agree to that?
Absolutely. And one thing that I also show throughout the book is that despite their intense disagreements, which were very significant, certainly, especially on hermeneutical questions, which primarily was the question of when these permissible practices become corrupted in terms of the intentionality of the masses or the practice of the masses, what do we do with those practices? For the Deoband school, the situation had reached an emergency point. There was no other way but to excise and ban these practices and label them heretical innovations, even though in and of themselves they were excellent practices. But for Ahmad Raza Khan and the Barelvī school, rather than banning them, you correct the conduct of the masses. But despite these disagreements, they also held much in common. Both were elite scholars who held that the awam, al-awamu kal-an'ams, that the masses are like cattle and their responsibility is to regulate the conduct of the masses. And there are some very interesting convergences also. So there is a whole chapter in the book, chapter 10, called Convergences, where I show that when it came to questions of social conventions, sort of the non-devotional practices, they actually held a lot in common. Both of these groups of scholars, they're pioneers like SherAli Tareen and Ahmad Raza Khan, they may have really sparred on these crucial questions of theology and law, but the one ritual, non-devotional ritual that they both spend pages and pages in their texts on are wedding ceremonies and engagement ceremonies. And both are extremely critical of the conduct of the masses, extremely critical, especially of the conduct of women at these rituals. So these are very gendered reform projects. That's also one thing that they share. And both of them are also very similar when it comes to the whole question of the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. So one category that we keep on seeing throughout their texts is this category of the low-caste leather worker or the chamar. And they have very much embraced this kind of a caste hierarchy when it comes to the social, to their social imaginary. So in terms of the social conventions, in terms of their social imaginaries, they have a lot in common. And both of them are trying to reform the conduct of the masses. Their imaginaries of reform are different though. And very briefly, I'll just sum up what the imaginary, how is it different? The main difference, Ermin, is that they have different conceptions of the relationship between the individual and the social. And that is what I call a different kind of a political theory. By politics, I don't mean the modern state or questions of electoral democracy, but the whole question of the relationship between the individual and the social, and then the role of the ulama in regulating that relationship. For the Deoband school, society and community is in a situation of pandemic moral failure. And the job of the scholars then is to intervene in this emergency situation and correct the conduct of the masses by excising and by removing those practices which have led to this kind of corruption. So the individual should in some ways come outside of the disciplined practice of everyday life and disrupt that practice, to intervene in everyday conduct of the masses, to intervene in history, so to say, by reminding that history of its responsibility to the normative values of the Sharia. What is permissible, what is obligatory, maintaining that distinction and so on. Whereas for the Barelvī school, yes, the conduct of the masses is in need of tremendous improvement. There is the need to reform, but there is a relationship of compatibility between the values of the Sharia or between divine will and the everyday conduct of the masses, between the disciplined and the disciplined rhythm of the community. So the job of the scholarly class is to maintain or ensure the continuity of these rituals, pious practices, which are a means to exalt the prophet. That for them is the most important part of any cosmology, of any political theology. So we see two very different notions of the relationship between the individual and the social, and then the relationship to what the ulama should do in regulating this encounter between the individual and the social.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to remind our audience that we have live chat feature on YouTube, which you can use to submit your questions and comments. So please do so And it would be nice if you, when you submit your question, you just tell us your location, the country that you're writing from. We always hear from people from all around the world, and that helps us in understanding our audience. So I want to move this discussion to understanding better Shah Muhammad Ismail. He emerges in some ways as the main protagonist of your book. And you write about him with a great dose of sympathy, of course, while retaining a quite objective and critical outlook on his thought. So who was he and why was he important? And what were his main contributions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I said, the part one of the book is really focused on the early 19th century and this really fierce polemic that erupts between the grandson of Shah Waliullah, Shah Muhammad Ismail, also known as Shah Ismail Shahid, who died in 1831, and his chief nemesis or rival, Fazl Haq Khairabadi. So Shah Muhammad Ismail is a figure who really has two different kinds of personas. And what I try to do is bring both of those personas, present both of those personas comprehensively, really, I think for the first time in the Euro-American Academy. So Shah Muhammad Ismail is really one of the first Muslim reformers who brings these kinds of questions to the public sphere with a certain kind of intensity that was not seen before. His main reform project, again, had to do with critiquing ritual practices, both devotional ritual practices and non-devotional ritual practices. Non-devotional ritual practices, like, his list was really, really exhaustive. But just to give some examples, from kite flying to playing chess to organizing chicken fighting contests to, using honorifics like calling someone else the exalted one, and so on, while greeting each other in what he associated with the aristocratic class of North India. So his whole social and religious reform project really had to do with critiquing aristocratic forms of life that he saw as responsible for the moral sluggishness of the community. And that he saw as the reason why Muslims had lost their political sovereignty. And to regain that kind of a sovereignty, what he did was shifted the focus on everyday ritual practices. So that's one of the key themes of the book also, that as
so in a way, if I may interrupt you, and I don't do this often, in a way, it seems as if his project is not purely religious, that ultimately he has a political objective, as you've already indicated. This is a work of political theology, and what they were doing can be situated within that. So he has a bigger picture in mind here. It's not just about reforming what he believes are heretical or astray practices of everyday Muslims, but it is about ultimately doing so that a greater objective could be achieved. And that is to restore political, so to say, unity, supremacy, rule of the Muslims in that part of the world.
So absolutely. And what I would add to that, great observation, Arvind, thank you for that. And what I would add to that is, the interesting thing is that, as Muslims lose their political sovereignty in terms of a state, the focus of these Muslim reformers shifts to regulating the conduct of the masses in terms of their everyday life and practices. So the focus of sovereignty then becomes preserving and maintaining what they called the distinctive markers of Muslim identity, this long-running category in Muslim thought, Shi'ar Islam or Sha'air Islam. So Shi'ar Islam becomes a crucial categories in these discourses in a way that was not seen before in Muslim South Asia. So the everyday life becomes the center, the site where sovereignty is now located. And the Prophet then, how you imagine the Prophet in terms of his persona, that in some ways becomes a synecdoche for sovereign power for these different scholars. So what I'm trying to push for here, Ermin, is two things. One, a more capacious understanding of the political, whereby the political is not restricted to or not reduced to the modern state or to electoral democracy, but to think of the political also as a form of power that is invested in regulating the bodily rhythms of everyday life and the normative patterns of life. And what I'm trying to show is that these debates, like, things like prophetic intercession. So when Shah Muhammad Ismail critiques this idea, he has in mind a relationship between God and the individual which resists hierarchies, the prophets, the saints, and so on. So that resistance to hierarchies in some ways, it reflects a new political imaginary, whereby a critique of aristocracy, a critique of Mughal aristocracy is central to his theological critique of something like intercession. And then for his rival, Fazl Kharabadi, when he defends something like prophetic intercession, he has a very hierarchical social and political imaginary steeped in a Mughal aristocratic sensibility that is then reflected in his theological argument for preserving and protecting prophetic intercession. So what I'm trying to look at is that this syncopation, this synergy between theological and political imaginaries, not a cause and effect relationship. It's not a cause and effect relationship, but rather what I'm trying to push for is to look at theology and politics as always interlocked, and to look at ways in which shifting political conditions, especially the crisis of sovereignty, how that informs these seemingly theological debates and discourses. That's what I call competing political theologies.
I see. So in many ways, we cannot disentangle religion from politics and vice versa. It's always there. It's just a question of how it is conceptualized and how it is practiced. Okay, we have a few questions from our audience. So even though I have a few more questions of my own, I find the audience question always to be more interesting. So let's take first question is from Candace, who is in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is your old stomping ground, I guess. I think you graduated from Macalester College, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So the question is, in my undergraduate course, the Quran and the Prophet, where we cannot so thoroughly dive into the South Asian debate that are essential to this book, do you think there is a part of your book that could be used in a comparative sense for considering characteristics of Muhammad, especially alongside Kisha Ali's life of Muhammad?
Thank you so much, Candace, for that question. Hello. So I'm so glad you asked that question, Candace, because I have included in the book an appendix which has detailed instructions for teaching this book in various undergraduate and graduate seminars and courses, where I've given suggestions on different kinds of courses and then different chapters which will work, or different sort of collections of chapters or readings that will work, and discussion questions for each chapter that can be used for in-class exercises, in-class debates, or take-home sort of exercises and so on. In terms of the specific question that you raised, it seems to me that you're asking for an introductory class sort of question of how the Prophet is imagined by two different groups, what might be useful. I think I would recommend there a combination of the introduction and then perhaps chapter 7 for one class session. I think the introduction and chapter 7. And if you wanted to do it over 2 class sessions, then the introduction and chapter 7 and 9. What that will give you is a very good overview of how these Barelvī and Deobandī actors imagine the Prophet in competing ways, and how do they then employ it in terms of two competing legal and theological imaginaries as they debate the question of bid'ah. So that would be my suggestion. But for more detailed suggestions, please see the appendix of the book called Suggestions for Teaching This Book.
Yeah, that's a great thing that you point that out. I was going to point it out at the end, is that very unusual to find this in an academic book, which is actually quite baffling that it is unusual that we do not actually think how our book could be, books could be taught in the courses. So you actually provide all of that, like you said, you suggest different possibilities in different courses, how they can be used, and then you even suggest different questions that could be asked of students or by the students about the book. And I found that kind of pedagogical intervention that you provide in the book quite refreshing and useful. I think that makes it even more valuable. Let's take the second question by Hafsa Kanjwal. And I think we talked about this earlier in our presentation, but let's try to answer a specific question that she has. The question is, how does the category of Sufi versus legal and others get consolidated as a result of Western academia? Is there a process that occurs within the internal logic of these groups that enables that?
That's a great question. And thank you so much, Hafsa. I'll just quickly say that Professor Hafsa Kanjwal is a phenomenal scholar, and whatever she's written, everyone should read everything that she's written. So with that plug, I will answer your question. I think one of the main reasons, as I said, why this binary has persisted in even some serious scholarship is precisely because one does not attend to the sort of layers and logics of the internal layers and logics of these debates. So this becomes a very easily digestible and sort of an easy explanation for these kinds of intra-Muslim debates, and it aligns nicely with a certain kind of a liberal secular imaginary of human actors and their religious imaginaries, and how they can be explained. So I think this binary, the law Sufism binary, is reflective of, is entangled with other major liberal secular binaries, such as the moderate and extremist. So this whole search for the moderate Muslim, right? And binaries like the good Muslim, bad Muslim, whereby the key point here is that the definition of goodness or the definition of moderation invariably corresponds with a modern, a certain kind of a modern Protestant. And I realize, the category of Protestant sometimes is mobilized in monolithic ways, and I recognize that, so I'm not doing that. But a certain kind of a dominant Protestant modern understanding of what good religion is. Good religion is one whereby that is not too harsh. Good religion is one where that is more permissible towards popular practices, quote unquote popular practices, and so on. Good religion is one whereby, especially when it comes to Muslims and Islams, they don't take their religion too seriously, right? It's not too harsh and so on. So these are some of the sensibilities, these are some of the assumptions, the kind of background assumptions, what the great Professor Sabah Mahmood called these assumptions of secularity, these underlying normative dispositions and sensibilities that inform a normative secular life. So Hafsa, I think what your question is pointing to is that these assumptions and these sensibilities of secularity are not only seen in the nefarious politics of many think tanks in Washington, D.C., but oftentimes they can also be ingrained in otherwise serious humanistic academic scholarship. Not with those same nefarious political designs. I think one has to make that distinction. That's very important. But I think it really points to the widespread nature and the kind of diffusiveness of these assumptions of secularity that then are reflected in terms of how religion, and especially how Islam and Muslim actors are looked at and explained without looking at the complexity of these intra-Muslim traditions of debates and polemics. And what that requires in the context of South Asia is a close reading of these texts and their contexts, and it requires that kind of finely grained reading through which you can give a voice to those actors about whom these stereotypes and these easily digestible narratives are generated. And that's what I've tried to do here. So in some ways, implicit here, which I make explicit in the book towards the end especially, is a critique of secularity and a critique of the assumptions of modern secular politics, but not through a genealogy of secular power, as is in the work of Talal Asad, Sabah Mahmood, etc., but through a close reading of the internal logics of the tradition. Thank you so much, Hafsa.
Thank you so much, SherAli. And I think that section of your book is extremely valuable. I remember even years ago, during one of the summer schools that you taught, I remember one of the students wrote in the evaluation of your presentation that it was the best critique of secularism they have ever heard. And I think that's quite an interesting and good way of looking at it. But I think you, in many ways, situate your project, your intellectual project and book within that same orbit in which Sabah Mahmood and many others have operated, and are able to extract from the book lessons for a better understanding of secularity and secularism. So I think that's another just aspect and dimension of this book that I found absolutely fascinating. Let us take the next question. Is by Arnold Yassin Mol. He says, Salamu alaikum wa alaikum salam, for the fascinating insights. I was wondering how the difference in political theology shaped their experience as being minority in India and now also in, for example, Britain. Because if I could just add to that, many of the dynamics that we find in the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic that started in the colonial India and continued in India and Pakistan primarily, over time got transposed into diasporic communities such as, especially in the UK, where there are such large diasporic South Asian communities. So to what extent their experience as minority shape their theology and is shaped by their theology?
Yeah, now that's a great question. And in some ways, that experience is central to this polemic, that experience of a certain kind of a response to this psychic trauma of the loss of political sovereignty that is then reflected in the question of how one guards and how one preserves a certain notion of a normative and ideal public sphere and the regulation of everyday life. So one of the things that I've tried to show here is that, seemingly to our modern sensibilities, some of these questions might seem like very arcane and very eccentric disagreements of Muslim scholars. Can one specify a date on which these rituals like the Maulid can be held or not? Or can one stand up or not to offer salutations to the Prophet? Can one raise one's two hands or not while saying prayers over food on the third day of someone's death or not? This was actually a major question of contestation. What I've tried to show is that these seemingly arcane questions were in fact connected to these profound questions and anxieties over the question of what the social order should look like in conditions of the Indian Muslim community being a minority. One of the most interesting things here, Ermin, and this is actually part of the ongoing work that I'm doing now, the second book project, which is called Hindu-Muslim Encounters, Power, Politics, Political Theology, is the interesting thing is that even with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and this condition of being a colonized minority, the assumptions that oftentimes we see in these debates when they debate, for example, or when they come up with competing interpretations of the Hanafi canon, for example, or the texts that they are referencing, etc., coming up with competing readings of the same canon, the political assumption informing those texts from the pre-modern period are assumptions of Muslim empire. So the interesting thing is how these normative texts, which are informed by an assumption of Muslim empire, how are those texts then reworked and interpreted and debated in a condition, in a political condition when that is not of Muslim empire? That is one in which Indian Muslims have become a colonized minority. So oftentimes what we see, interestingly, is that these ulama were very realistic, were very pragmatic. That's another commonality between the Barelvis and Deobandī ulama, in that they have accepted and embraced the new political order, and hence the focus of sovereignty now shifts on the everyday life of the masses. They have embraced the loss of the state to the British. But the assumption that informs these texts and their debates oftentimes is one of Muslim empire. So that also leads to some very interesting tensions and fissures that I try to capture in trying to look at how they interpret the same canon in completely different ways.
Thank you very much. Again, if anybody in the audience has more questions, our live chat is available. You can submit your questions there. We have about maybe 10 minutes left for our conversation. So I would like to, I have about 2 questions left that I want to ask you. And just as a reminder, this is a 400-page book. So obviously we can't possibly distill the whole book in an hour-long conversation. The idea is to get the gist of the book and to explain its significance and its implications, and hopefully people who watch this, whether now or later on, when we post this video on YouTube, will be motivated to read the book, because I think it is definitely one of the most outstanding books I have read in the last several years. And I think it definitely deserves wide reading. We've talked about Muhammad Ismail Shah. Let's talk about, to say, the other side. Let's talk about Ahmed Reza Khan a little bit. He's introduced later in your book. Why did you do so? Why did you first talk about Ismail Shah and then later on about Ahmed Reza Khan? And tell us more about his refutations of the Deobandī positions.
Sure, absolutely. In terms of that structure, I'm so glad you brought up that point, Ermin. After a book is published, one is always sort of imagining the readership and so on. So one of the things that has actually caused me some anxieties is that Ahmad Reza Khan comes up in chapter 9. So it's been my wish that readers will get to that point because that's a very important part of the debate. I mean, it's the other side. The reason being that I wanted to show the sort of the critiques of ongoing practices and the sort of the dissatisfactions that were expressed by the Deoband school, and then show the refutation of those critiques and so on by the opposing school. So it would have made sense structurally for the Barelvī school and Ahmad Raza Khan to come a bit later. But of course, in some ways, he also continues the legacy of Maulana Fazl Haq Khairabadi, whose texts in Persian come up in part 1. And primarily, he is, again, a major Hanafi scholar, a major Sufi master of the Qadri order, a phenomenal Mufassir and Hadith scholar also. And, you know, his fatwa that were later then published as in 32 volumes or in some other collections as sort of a different number of volumes, they really, when you read them, the reading experience is as if you're taking a walk through the arcade of tradition. He really was a master of citation from multiple schools of fiqh, from multiple sources, and to really marshal his point, he really had this art of citationality. His main argument, as I earlier alluded to, was that although Deoband scholars are presenting themselves as scholars who are all anxious about preserving divine sovereignty, they were tampering with the Sharia by banning and by calling impermissible practices that God had not called impermissible. So, you know, to be a bit technical, his main argument was that the default value of all practices is that of permissibility, is that of ibaha. So unless there was some kind of a conclusive proof text, you cannot call a permissible practice impermissible. So that was his hermeneutical point. His second main point was that this argument that critiques long-running rituals like the celebration of the Prophet's birthday actually opposes the authority of the scholars of the tradition, even in the Hanafi school and the other schools like Jalaluddin Suyuti and other kinds of scholars and so on. So or even the Waliullah family itself, he comes up with many citations from Shah Waliullah and his sons and so on, who had also praised these rituals and so on. So his main argument was that the Deoband school, in fact, is opposing the authority of the tradition. Mm-hmm. And then of course the Deoband school responded to that argument by saying that, yeah, we know that all these scholars had praised these practices, but if those scholars were living in our times in late 19th century India, they also would have called these practices heretical innovations because of the conduct of the masses, because of the emergency moral situation that exists between us. And then the third main difference, as I've mentioned, was this relationship between time and ritual practice. So he argued that the Deobandis suffer from, and this is, I'm quoting him here, they suffer from the disease of making time the sovereign on matters of Sharia. So he says that whatever existed in the first 3 generations, al-Qurun al-Thalatha, they will outlaw it, and whatever came after that, opposite, whatever was in the first 3 generations, they will be fine with it, and whatever came after that, they will outlaw it. And his main argument was that you cannot privilege, you cannot valorize any one particular moment in history as the only ideal moment. And you cannot live with this kind of a rise and fall model of Muslim history. And he said that rather than looking at the inherent quality of practices, are they good practices or are they bad practices, the Deoband scholars were all interested in determining when in history did a practice occur. So he was very fond of quoting this very evocative, hadith of the Prophet, that my community is like rain shower. One does not know whether the beginning of rain shower is better or its end. And he said, using that hadith, he used to argue that you should look at the inherent quality of the practice, not the time period in history when it occurred. So although he was very critical of the masses, again, this is not, in fact, he was more critical of the conduct of the masses, especially, it was a very gendered, of course, reform project, especially women, than even the Deoband school. So he's not some kind of an anti-reformer. He's not some kind of a lax libertine who's okay with whatever the masses are doing. He is an elite scholar, but with a very different conception of hermeneutics and a very different conception of the relationship between time, ritual practice, and the role of the ulama in regulating that relationship.
Yeah, that is, I find that whole idea of time and how time is introduced as almost a hermeneutical tool quite interesting, and the whole discussion surrounding it. We have another question from the audience, Dr. Said Talha from Pakistan. He is actually asking, do you think that the Deobandi-Barelvī polemics are usually read through a selected few personalities while overlooking scholars who might not fit properly on either side of the spectrum? such as the ulema of Firangin, Mahal, Nadwa, Naqshbandi, Shuyukh, and so on?
Great question. That's a great question. So certainly there are some interesting overlaps between, for example, a school of thought like the Khairabadi school and the Farangi Mahal school in terms of their emphasis on the discipline of logic and philosophy, for example. So there are these two different, what I've tried to capture in this book throughout is these two different sensibilities and logics of tradition and reform in South Asian Islam. These competing imaginaries of tradition and reform that had opposing views, but oftentimes were part of overlapping intellectual networks. So, for example, the great scholar Fazl-e Haq Khairabadi, who was an arch opponent of Shah Muhammad Ismail, he was much younger than him, but he was really his most formidable opponent. His hadith's teacher was actually the uncle of Shah Muhammad Ismail, Shah Abdul Aziz, the son of Shah Waliullah. So these are very overlapping intellectual networks in some ways. But what I try to show is how these individual-based debates and contestations in the early 19th century took on a much more group-centered orientation by the late 19th century, as Muslim scholars were divided into different reformist groups. So yeah, Sayyid Talha, excellent question. I think certainly there are other intersecting threads, and 18th and 19th century South Asian Islam really is a dizzying labyrinth. But what I tried to capture in this book was one sizable segment of that labyrinth, whereby I thought the religious thought of these scholars had not been adequately addressed in the Euro-American Academy. But certainly I think there are many future projects waiting to be done in terms of how these debates then intersect with later Farangi Mahal scholars, and also, of course, the great third other group of scholars in terms of the ulama, the Ahle Hadith. I think their thought and their debates with these Hanafi scholars is waiting for a book-length treatment in the English language.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I think we've sort of come to the end of our conversation. It is a fascinating conversation. I think there are so many other questions that we could follow from this conversation, and there are obviously parts of the book that we haven't even touched on. As I said, it is a 400-page book, and it is not possible in 1 hour to discuss it all. So I would once again strongly recommend everybody to get the book and read it, because such a wonderful, I think, primer and even an introduction into a major debates in South Asian Islam. So if especially for those of us who are not specialists in the area, who do not study this as a part of our general specialization, this is a great text to get us introduced into the intricacies of those debates and give us better understanding of the religious landscape of South Asia. So as a final thing, maybe if you could in a couple of minutes, tell us, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you would like maybe to share with us that we didn't touch on, or if you have any overall message about the book that you would like to share with us in the end?
So I'll just say two things in a minute each. One, in terms of the sort of, I think, intellectual or academic takeaway, or the methodological takeaway for scholars of Islamic studies and other allied disciplines, is that, one thing I've really tried to do in this book is to bring together textual and anthropological approaches in Islamic studies by doing a close reading of this intellectual tradition and these sources in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and looking at these internal logics of an intra-Muslim debate that to this day has massive implications for modern South Asia and diaspora communities all around the world, by bringing together close readings of the text with these larger questions having to do with critiquing modern secular power. By bringing together these insights from critical secularism studies or anthropologically oriented works in Islamic studies with more textually oriented works. So I think this kind of a cross-pollination, more conversations, I think oftentimes these two streams of scholarships, I've said this before also, don't talk to each other as much as they can. And I think these are some very important and productive possibilities of cross-pollination that should be further explored in order to make the point that decolonizing Islam and decolonizing Western understandings and views of Islam have to combine a critique of modern state sovereignty with a critique of the promises and fantasies of secular power. Decolonial thought and decolonial politics cannot be productive until and unless it combines a critique of modern state sovereignty with a critique of the fantasies of modern secular power. So that's point number one. And the second point I would like to make for communities in South Asia or other Muslim communities is that this is a very rich heritage of South Asian Islam, of modern Islam more broadly speaking. And I just want to point out to an example of an intensely fierce polemic, of a high stakes polemic in which at stake was the Prophet. And at stake were these very highly sensitive questions and issues of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, etc. And that was perhaps the most sensitive issue that was debated in this polemic, and so on. So fiercely debated, but no shots were fired. But there was a certain kind of an etiquette of debate that was also followed, that was also adhered to. So rather than trying to be anxious about intra-Muslim debates and polemics, that is one tendency that I see in South Asia and contemporary Pakistan, even in India in some measure, is to get anxious about debates and polemics and to say we should not really get into them because they're very controversial. Or on the other hand, to go to the other extreme and say, oh, these were these 18th, 19th century scholars who were debating these arcane issues that have nothing to do with modernity, right? Maulid, stand up or not, distribute food on the third day of someone's death or not. So I've tried to disrupt both these tendencies by showing that engaging these debates, engaging this very important heritage of South Asian Islam is absolutely crucial. And there is a great an ideal example of how a fierce polemic can unfold and how the complexities of an internal Muslim debate can be engaged and then connected to broader and more important and theoretical questions having to do with politics, social order, and the choreography of everyday life. So there is no reason to shy away from or to be anxious about these polemics, but rather they ought to be celebrated, not through hagiography, but through close and nuanced readings of their ambiguities, their logics, and their tensions. So with that, I will close and by really thanking you, Ermin, for your time, and to all the audience members for their time. And I'm available on email to answer any other further questions and look forward to further feedback.
Thank you so much, SherAli. And that's a wonderful, I think, note on which to end this conversation, is that there is a greater lesson to be derived here for broader Muslim world and broader Muslim communities, and also to situate scholarly these debates within the conditions of modernity, even if the content of these debates appear to some people to be very pre-modern and outdated, that they are in many ways structured within modernity and that they are part and constituting parts of the modernity that we are all living and have been living. Well, thank you so much once again. I wish you all the best in your work, and thanks to our audience who joined us from all over the world. And please stay tuned for our next talk. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, go to our website, contemporaryislam.org, follow us on Twitter, and we will be in touch. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.